We all have a certain capability for resilience, and that capability can be enhanced and developed over time. And that's the second part. Resilience isn't fixed. It's not finite. We can continue to grow and develop over the course of our lives. That's the good news. It's not that we got a certain amount of resilience when we were born, and that's it. That's what we have for the rest of our lives. This is a skill and a strength, a resource and a series of tools that we can continue to develop. Well, welcome to all of you. We are here with season 2 of Flourish or Fold. What you will find is that we have a tremendous new season all lined up for you. It's the engaging, exciting, innovative, inspiring interviews that you came to know in season 1. And what we heard from all of you is you wanted to have more solo episodes with me, more time with me to learn about resilience, the concepts of the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, the myths and truths of resilience. And so here we are, we're doing it together. In our first episode of season 2, today we are talking about what exactly is resilience? What stands in our way of harnessing our personal and professional resilience? And what might be some of those myths of resilience that we don't even recognize that we subscribe to that are getting in the way of our ability to access our most resilient life? Well, let me start by saying that I've always believed that resilience finds us, that we don't have to go looking for resilience. This isn't something that exists outside of ourselves. Certainly, it is a skill and a capability that we get to cultivate. And as humans, being resilient is the essence of what it means to be at the epicenter of our humanity. It's not whether we're resilient or not, it's how resilient are we going to be. Now, I grew up in a household where I learned early on that anything that I wanted to know about the world could be looked up, but not on Google. What I learned was we had a set of Encyclopedia Britannicas in our living room and a really large dictionary. It was so heavy I could barely pick it up when I was younger. We called it the Arnold Schwarzenegger Dictionary because it was so thick. And what I learned was in the context of our living room, I could learn about the world. And when I had questions about what resilience was, I found that the definition of resilience at the time was really circular. To be resilient meant to demonstrate resilience, and resilience meant to be resilient. And I thought, this is a really important term for us, a really important concept for us as humans. I want to understand more. So fast forward to me getting my graduate degree. This is when I'm making about $20 an hour, when some of our early entrepreneurs in their 20s have already made millions of dollars. And what I started doing as a young neuropsychology fellow was sitting with patients in our outpatient clinic, patients that had sustained brain injuries months or sometimes even years before. And what I noticed as I sat with our patients learning about their rehabilitation trajectory was that we were so often wrong about their prognosis. We were so often incorrect about what would happen to them and their families after they were discharged from the hospital. And so I wanted to find out, really, how could we provide people with more accurate information at the time that they had a brain injury? And how could we understand how people were doing better than we initially thought, and what might be detracting from people's rehabilitation over time? What we found was really stunningly surprising and also incredibly simple. We found that people that had access to reliable transportation, We found that people that had access to reliable transportation, these were the people that did better than anyone else after a brain injury or a spinal cord injury, after a neurological injury. And what's fascinating is, statistically speaking, this was the difference between people who were able to live independently after an injury and people who needed to live in an assisted care facility. And we all know how important our independence is to us. And so when I continued to think about this idea of reliable transportation, as I transitioned to being a management consultant, I thought to myself, we all won't face brain injuries and spinal cord injuries, but we all will face challenge, change, and complexity, because this is the fabric or the very essence of what it means to be human. And what if in those moments when we face challenge, change, and complexity, we knew what those productive or positive things are that we could do that would change the outcome of those moments, that would allow us to respond in a way where we could react most meaningfully and most thoughtfully when we face challenge. And so I began asking people a simple question. And the question was, I asked them to think about a moment in their lives where they faced a significant challenge, change, or complexity. And what did they do to effectively address that challenge? Now, this language was intentional because, first and foremost, challenge provides an opportunity for us to talk about both the positive and negative aspects of an experience. I think when we reflect on our lives, we find that very few things that we encounter are all positive or all negative. And so challenge gives us that nuance, that opportunity to look at the valence of our experience in a way where we can account for things that might have been positive or meaningful or growth oriented, and to also account for the things that felt hard or difficult, sad or traumatic, disappointing, or like a loss. And after I interviewed hundreds of people and collected thousands of pieces of data, what this led to was the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. Now, we are going to be talking about each one of these practices as we embark on season 2 together. I'm going to do a solo episode on each one of the 5 practices where we're going to get to dig deep together on what these practices are. And I want to incorporate direct teaching from me to you on what each of these practices are, what their definition is, how we think about these practices, how they might show up in our lives, how we harness them, and to recognize some of the ways that we might be able to do more of a particular practice to enhance our resilience. Before we talk about each one of those 5 practices, what I want to spend the balance of this episode sharing with you is 2 things. First is the definition of resilience. This is incredibly foundational for our journey together. Here's the definition of resilience. Resilience means to effectively face challenge, change, and complexity in a way that enhances us, not diminishes us. Period. That's the end. This is what I was looking for all those years ago when I was in my living room with our encyclopedias and our dictionary. I know my childhood sounds terribly exciting, but try not to get stuck on that for a moment. Because when we think about this definition, what's powerful is not only what the definition contains, the idea of showing up and effectively addressing challenge and allowing ourselves to be enhanced, to develop, to grow through those moments, as opposed to being reduced or diminished. Another piece of this that's important is what's not in this definition. See, what we don't hear are things like overcome challenge. What I've learned in my research and my study, and even in my personal experience, is so often the idea of overcoming challenge doesn't really resonate with so many of us. There isn't a once and for all moment where we feel like we've been victorious over challenge. Often it's the long walks, it's the limping, it's the crawling, it's the starts and stops of facing challenge. And that challenge diminishes or is ameliorated over time. But not so often is there a moment, oftentimes, where we feel victorious over a challenge. And so resilience is about effectively addressing challenge, not being victorious once and for all. The second thing that you don't hear in this definition is the idea of quickly recovering. So often we think that in order to be resilient, we have to go back to work 3 days after we've lost someone that's important to us, or we need to quickly recover from the losses, the rejections, the hurts, the griefs that occur in our lives. And in fact, what I found in my research is it's not the people who come back the soonest. It's not the people who are the ones that return to work or go back to their daily lives that are the most resilient. In fact, oftentimes we can go back too early. We cannot give ourselves enough time to grieve, enough time to reflect, enough time to integrate the experience that's happened to us. So going forward, we're going to operate from this idea that the definition of resilience is to effectively address challenge and to allow that challenge to enhance us, not diminish us over time. Now, before we close out today, what I want to share with you are the 3 common myths that show up for all of us when we think about resilience. And these myths are important for us to know. First and foremost, because it's a faulty way of thinking about resilience. Second of all, often believing in these myths blocks our ability to harness and interact with resilience. Now, the first myth might be one of the most powerful. The myth is that when we are resilient, we bounce back. The truth of resilience is that when we face challenge, change, and complexity, we actually bounce forward. Now, what does this mean? What it means is every time we face challenge or any experience in our lives, we are fundamentally and forever changed in that moment. We don't go back to the way that we were before we faced that experience. In fact, if you even just think about this from a neurological perspective, maybe you're familiar with the concept of neuroplasticity, the idea that the neurons in our brain are constantly growing, regenerating, creating new connections, and breaking old connections between neurons that no longer serve us. What neuroplasticity tells us is that down to the molecular level, down to the cellular level, our brains, our neurons are constantly shifting and changing, rewiring, and firing in new ways to represent our experience. And so if we're changing down to the cellular level, why would we expect to go back to the way that we were before we faced a particular experience? What I find in so many of the people that I work with is people come to me and they say, Dr. Taryn, I feel like I've been resilient in a particular circumstance. I feel like I've done what I can to effectively address this challenge, but I haven't gone back to the way that I was before. And you see, that's the way that resilience can be tricky, because resilience isn't about bouncing back. It's about bouncing forward. It's about taking our experience, integrating that experience, allowing ourselves to be changed, and drawing on the wisdom of that experience to move forward. Now, what also might happen is we might need to grieve the things that we lost, the things that aren't coming back, the things that are going to be different as we bounce forward into this new version of ourselves and into our lives. And so the first myth of resilience is that we bounce back. The truth of resilience is that we bounce forward. Second myth that I want to talk to you about is this idea that resilience is fixed or finite. Many people ask me if they are resilient, or many people say, I haven't been resilient. Well, let me tell you, if you're listening to this podcast right now, if you're watching this, you have demonstrated resilience as a human since the day you were born. It's not whether we're resilient or not. It's that we all have a certain capability for resilience. And that capability can be enhanced and developed over time. And that's the second part. Resilience isn't fixed, it's not finite. We can continue to grow and develop over the course of our lives. That's the good news. It's not that we got a certain amount of resilience when we were born, and that's it. That's what we have for the rest of our lives. This is a skill and a strength, a resource, and a series of tools that we can continue to develop. And the third myth of resilience is that resilience is passive. We often talk about time healing all wounds. Well, what does that tell us? It tells us that we're simply going to be passive, wait for time to pass, and eventually we'll feel better, we'll get better, and we'll move on with our lives. And really, it's more akin to what Andy Warhol said, which is time changes things and we have to change them ourselves. And so when we think about resilience, it's not just waiting for time. It's not just waiting for circumstances to change us. We get to take an active role in how we're being shaped and formed by our very experiences. So when you think about resilience, the key messages today are the definition of resilience is to effectively address challenge and to allow ourselves to be enhanced and not diminished by our experiences. And the myths and truths of resilience are myth one, we bounce back. Instead, what we know is that we bounce forward instead of bouncing back. Let me say that differently. And so when we think about the myths and truths of resilience, the truth of resilience is we bounce forward, not back. The second truth of resilience is that resilience is growth oriented and infinite rather than being fixed or finite. And the third truth of resilience is that resilience is an active process that we engage in, not passive. Thanks for being here today for our very first episode of season 2, Flourish or Fold, Stories of Resilience, where well-known people tell their lesser well-known stories of resilience. I appreciate you showing up for this micro teaching lesson where we learned the definition of resilience and the myths and truths of resilience. Next time we get together, I'm going to talk about why we don't want to push the experience of challenge, change, and complexity out of our lives. We'll talk about how challenge is actually here to form us and how we can engage in resilience and the experience of challenge to not only face what's happening in our lives, but to think about how we can form ourselves into the top 5% of people that are able to show up in the most agile and effective ways when we face challenge. Until next time, beautiful having you with us. And thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Flourish or Fold, Stories of Resilience with me, Dr. Taryn Marie.